So to begin then, nous, Israel, hello everyone. I am Stephanie Birtles, the director of BD's Center for Corporate Governance and Sustainability. I join you today as a guest in the beautiful, traditional, ancestral, and unceded homelands of the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh Nations. It is my pleasure to begin by introducing Cheryl Rivers from the Squamish Nation, a graduate of our very first Indigenous Business Leadership and Education Executive EMBA cohort, and the owner of Rivers Consulting, to welcome us today. Cheryl, welcome.
Hotchquaquile, an Hotsqualuin Tiet Staves, Siam Ci Inagueto. Chisha Tameo, Che Siam, an Hotsqualuin, Siam Tanat Mulne di Honors Krishamansna, Cheryl Rivers Queensna, Chenwahwe Skotmish Osh, Chenwahwe Oslahan Ochameach, Hoichach Siam Mariana. Good morning. I'd like to welcome everyone to the traditional territory, Coast Salish territory. I am from the Squamish Nation, as was mentioned, and I live across I call it the modern canoe, the sea bus, and that's how I would transport myself to finish my degree at BD. And it's an honor to be asked to be here to do the traditional welcoming. I thank the Creator for inviting us all here together to be one heart, one mind, one spirit, and thank the Creator for allowing us to come and listen to, as we say in our language, Siam, which is someone of high ranking. And I want to thank you for sharing your knowledge with us here this morning. So I'd like to thank you all for coming, and thank you from the Coast Salish territories of Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh. And as my late mother would also like to include is Tsleil-Waututh. She liked to include the 4 directions. So I wish you all a good day, and thank you for being here, and ask the Creator to bless each and every one and take care of each and every one in our families and the ones suffering with illness. Hoichach, thank you.
Hoichach, thank you, Cheryl. I'd like to invite Emily Kerr, Vice President of Business Banking at BMO Financial Group, one of the supporters of this event, to make some welcoming remarks.
Thank you, Stephanie, and good morning, everyone. My name is Emily Kerr, and I'm Vice President Business Banking at Bank of Montreal. It's an honor to be here with you today. As a proud alum of Simon Fraser University, I'm delighted to have been invited to participate in this event today. BMO and SFU have been partnering for over 40 years through gifts to awards and programming at the BD School of Business. This partnership is second nature for us, since supporting education has long been a cornerstone of BMO's sponsorship and community giving programs. Whether it happens in the classroom, in a laboratory, or over the internet, learning makes our lives richer, our societies more successful, and our future brighter. As Stephanie explained, the BMO Lecture Series Endowment was established in 1988. Over the years, it has brought together distinguished economists and business practitioners like Mariana Mazzucato, whom we'll be hearing from shortly. Today's conference focuses on governance and sustainability, and I'm so proud to work for an organization that has been on the forefront of concrete actions for an inclusive society and sustainable future. Inspired by our purpose at BMO to boldly grow the good in both business and in life, BMO has committed several initiatives such as Zero Barriers to Inclusion by 2025 to provide opportunities and enable growth for our colleagues, customers, and the communities we serve. We've also committed to mobilize $445 billion for sustainable finance by 2025, and we've issued our first sustainability bond, allocating $500 million US to a range of environmental and social asset categories, including renewable energy, green buildings and infrastructure, pollution prevention and control, sustainable land use, Indigenous communities, and women-owned businesses. Sustainability is core to our business, and these are just a few examples of the tangible actions at BMO that we're taking towards it. We are so proud that our actions are having an impact and we've achieved global recognition. We are the top ranked, that's right, the top ranked North American bank on Corporate Knights Global 100 Most Sustainable Corporations in the world, and first amongst the major Canadian banks. We're also number 9 overall on Corporate Knights Best 50 Corporate Citizens in Canada. We ranked number 15 on the Wall Street Journal's 100 Most Sustainably Managed Companies in the World. That's the only bank in the top 50 and the only Canadian bank. Building a strong and sustainable future requires dedication to creating positive change and taking meaningful actions to make that change a reality. Strong businesses have the power to drive social and economic change. They must act as change agents and lead the way in protecting our natural resources and creating equal opportunities for individuals, businesses, and communities to thrive. On behalf of BMO, I would like to thank Simon Fraser University for allowing us to contribute to developing innovative, socially responsible business leaders with a global perspective who will lay foundations for generations to come. On behalf of the entire team at BMO, thank you for the opportunity to be part of this event today. And I'll turn it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. It's now my pleasure to welcome SFU President Joy Johnson to provide a few words of welcome and thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Stephanie. It really is a pleasure to be here today. I want to begin also by thanking Cheryl Rivers for that wonderful welcome. With my hands up to you for really starting us out in a good way. I want to begin by saying that I am privileged to be speaking to you today from the traditional territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Coquitlam peoples. And I want to pay my respect to elders, past and present. I want to say welcome virtually to Simon Fraser University's lecture with Mariana Mazzucato. I'm really looking forward to this lecture. I want to thank all of you for joining us. On behalf of SFU, I'd like to thank the John M. Munro Lecture Endowments and the Bank of Montreal's BMO Lecture Series for your generous support of this lecture series. The Munro Lecture is an annual address that brings leading scholars to SFU in recognition of our former Vice President, Academic and Provost, Jacques Munro. I'm absolutely delighted to have Jacques in the audience today. Big hello to you. I want to thank you for being here with us. Today's lecture is co-produced by SFU Public Square, a signature initiative of SFU's vision to be Canada's most community-engaged research university, and SFU's BD Center for Corporate Governance and Sustainability. By providing you opportunities to hear from and engage with leading thinkers, these lectures really are designed to enlighten and promote dialogue on important issues of public interest. I'm really, as I said, looking forward to today's lecture. It brings forth thought-provoking discourse, I assume, about capitalism and what we can do to tackle the grand challenges of our times. I've read some of Mariana's work. I know we're in for a real treat today. It's presented by an internationally renowned economist and SFU's 2020 honorary degree recipient. So it's now my pleasure to invite our moderator, Professor Stephanie Bertels, Director of the SFU Center for Corporate Governance and Sustainability, back to introduce our speaker. Over to you, Stephanie.
Thanks so much, President Johnson, and thanks for your support for events like these, as well as your own genuine interest in supporting positive change. In a moment, I will formally introduce Dr. Mariana Mazzucato, who will set the stage for our conversation. And then I will follow up with a few questions and invite two guests to do the same. At that point, we are eager to tackle some of your questions. And so we encourage you to enter your questions into the Q&A platform. I'd also like to draw your attention to our community guidelines, which you'll find in the chat. We ask that everyone respect these guidelines to have a safe and thoughtful discussion together. You can leave a question, as I mentioned, for Mariana at any time in the Q&A down at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to address as many questions as we can. And finally, I would just like to note that our discussion today focuses on the potential of a mission-oriented approach to advance ambitious policy goals. I hope that you can understand that we will not be discussing specific policy directions under consideration by the BC government, or the specifics of the ongoing work between Professor Mazzucato and the BC government. And with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce Mariana Mazzucato, Professor of Economics of Innovation and Public Value at University College London, and founding director of the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. Welcome, Mariana.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Cheryl, for those amazing words. I just cannot wait to actually finally visit SFU so I can meet you all in person. Thank you, President Johnson. Thank you, Joy. Thank you, Pam, everyone. So it's a real honor. And I'm going to share my screen now because this is always a tricky bit where you try not to also share strange things on your screen. Here we go. And I'll put on my timer. It's a real honor to be speaking to you all because we seem to just keep reacting to the problems that we have. BC has been at the center stage of the symptoms of a huge crisis, the climate crisis. And how can we go beyond the symptoms? How can we actually start really going after the core, the seed of our problems in terms of how we have basically created a pretty dysfunctional type of global capitalism, which in the end, and this will be very much in the spirit of what I'll talk about, it's an outcome of the choices we're making. There's nothing deterministic about climate change, deterministic about how unprepared we have found ourselves with COVID-19. These are all outcomes of choices that we make within businesses, the kind of corporate governance structures we have within governments, the remit of government, what is the role of government in modern 21st century capitalism, the role of civic society, civil society, and the degree to which we even allow social movements to be part of this drive for change. What is a green transition? Who decides what green even is? Who's at the table? Who's not at the table? Whose voices are being heard? So I really want to kind of go to the core of the problem and argue that unfortunately we have a very problematic framing and we need to change how we actually understand the economy itself as an outcome of all these decisions in order to unpick and debunk some of the underlying assumptions in those decisions. And this is a particular moment in history which the history books will write about, and they will also write about whether we learned or whether we just continue to make the same mistakes. And what we've learned in this particular period is, again, just how ill prepared we are. And this is not going to be the last pandemic. Apparently, if you read the scientific journals, as the permafrost melts, other viruses will come out. But how are we prepared? What do we do? What do we do within our economies? Do we have, capacity within our public sector to do things like roll out a test and trace system very early on, deliver personal protection equipment to our frontline workers who we call essential, but then we don't actually treat them as essential because we have not been valuing, care workers in many parts of the world. And, had this crisis begun, for example, in some African countries, which have much, much weaker health systems than China does, where the crisis broke initially, everyone would be worse off. So hopefully this has been a wake-up moment in terms of how we need to resource and value and render really essential global health systems. And I'm also, quite proud to be chairing a council for the World Health Organization called the Economics Council of Health for All. Because what we really need to do is start with the ambition, health for all, and then backtrack. What does that mean for the economy? What does it mean for how we think about budgeting, debt to GDP, procurement, public-private partnership, intellectual property rights, and so on. So hopefully this COVID-19 moment will be that awakening moment that we can't continue to go from crisis to crisis to crisis. And of course, in BC, as I mentioned, you have been at the front line of the symptoms of the biggest, one of the biggest crises that we are facing as humanity, which is climate change and global warming. And, if you listen to Greta Thunberg when she was just 16, she said, what do you do when your house is on fire? Do you sit there and debate, should I stay? Should I go? What should I do? You get the hell out. And we are not getting out of this crisis at all at the pace we should be. On August 6th, the IPCC report came out, another report. They had already issued one 3 years ago, arguing back then that we only had 10 years left until global warming was completely irreversible. And if you look at the different statistics here on the screen, you'll see, unfortunately, we're not moving quickly, as Greta says, that we should be. Even under the COVID-19 period with the recovery funding, something like 56% has been allocated to energy companies that are still based on fossil fuel projects. So hardly an example of change happening at the pace that it should be. And so what does it mean to stop going from crisis to crisis to crisis? You know, again, the 2007, 2008 financial crisis. What does it mean to not wait for these problems to arrive, to actually do what needs to be done? And you'll know that lots of money is currently being injected into the system. You know, Biden is talking about a 4 to 6 trillion infrastructure recovery package, just, you know, a couple years after we were told there was no money. In the European Union, we have the Next Gen EU program. Just after years of austerity, after the financial crisis, we were told there was no money and that somehow it was public debt that had caused the crisis, when actually it had, you know, it was private debt that got us into the crisis. And we went through 10 years of austerity, which ironically only increased debt to GDP in many countries, because then by not actually financing, both through public and private investment, all the areas that we need to render our economies and our society strong, we end up having to pick up the mess afterwards. So what I'd like to do is just spend maybe 5 minutes maximum just on why deep, deep change is needed. And just kind of going back to that first point, that the economy itself is an outcome of how we structure all the different actors in the economy that create value. And how can we look at those governance mechanisms and the decisions that we're currently making within finance, within business and corporate governance. So thank you to the Beatty School for having a center on corporate governance and sustainability. It's exactly those kinds of conversations we need to go to the core of the problem, but also the governance of the state sector, right? All the different types of public organizations. We might talk about public goods, but if the governance mechanisms themselves don't have that notion of the common good at the center, we don't reach that good result. And we end up again going from crisis to crisis. And what does it mean to really pay a lot of attention to the interactions between these different organizations? So firstly, again, I'm just going to do this quite quickly and superficially in terms of where the problem is. And then I want to spend most of the time on the solution. So, you know, one of the first problems is that we have a global financial sector which has basically been financing itself. So FIRE is finance, insurance, and real estate. In the UK, where I'm sitting today, something like 80% of our funds are that from the broadly defined financial sector go back into this finance, insurance, and real estate. So for example, even with COVID-19 recovery programs, we just made it easier for people to take out loans. Businesses took out loans at low interest rates because we needed to give them cash. We made it easier for people to buy houses because this was seen as one of the ways to recover from the crisis. Now, if your wages have not been increasing for the last 2 or 3 decades, maybe it's not a good idea to buy a house. Maybe what we really need are policies that increase your wages, that increase productivity, that reinvest profits into things like better working conditions and make sure that worker wages actually increase with productivity increases, something that if you look globally, we haven't seen, given that the labor share of GDP, of global GDP, is at a record low. So the fact that we then, put these loans into the system and make it easy to take out mortgages is potentially just going to bring us to the next financial crisis. In fact, if you look at the ratios of private debt, again, everyone obsesses about public debt, but the ratio of private debt to disposable income is back at record levels globally. And that should be on the front pages of newspapers like the Financial Times, and it's not. Now, this figure, by the way, is from the Bank of England, from someone called Andy Haldane, who was the chief economist, and this just shows just how much in the UK, but this is also true in the US and in many economies that have kind of followed that Anglo-Saxon model of capitalism, the degree to which financial intermediation has been outpacing the growth of the rest of the economy. And as long as that finance was going into the real economy, that would be sort of fine, but it's not. And there's different studies that have shown that, coming back to that earlier point, about 80% going back into FIRE. Now, if that was the only problem, that would be okay. Then we could just focus on that. The problem is that in the real economy itself, so in the business community, we have businesses, so the real economy has become financialized itself. And what do I mean by that? I mean that profits, when they're generated, ideally would get reinvested back into production, back into, again, increasing improving working conditions, investing in research and development, increasing the capacity on the ground of factories and investing in new machinery, again, research, innovation, and so on. And yet what we've seen since the 1980s with this obsession about maximizing shareholder value is increasing use of gimmicks like just buying back your own shares to boost stock prices, stock options, and executive pay, which is kind of a lack of reinvestment. And you see this, I should have included a graph here on this because it's quite striking. You see it in terms of global investment as a percentage of GDP falling. And this is really important because when we hear things like the robots are taking our jobs, it's like, really? These poor robots are just sitting there waiting to be commanded. The robots aren't taking our jobs. It's the corporate governance decisions that we're making, which are potentially eliminating jobs. Why? Because when profits are not reinvested back in, then we don't have that kind of creative destruction of new jobs, new skills, new sectors appearing elsewhere. And it's interesting to remember that David Ricardo, one of the first economists ever, when he wrote his famous textbook, Principles of Political Economy, he was already warning back in 1821 about this labor displacement effect with mechanization. And also Karl Marx wrote about that. Adam Smith in his early writings was thinking about that as well. And what you then had for about 200 years was that as long as profits were being reinvested from the income that was being generated, the wealth that was being generated from the Industrial Revolution, then yes, it was labor displacing, but new jobs would appear, new skills and sectors. And when that stops, when that reinvestment cycle stops because profits are getting financialized, that is a huge problem. And this is why you have many in the corporate community actually talking about the need for change. I don't know how many of you have heard or been to places like Davos at the World Economic Forum. Well, there's lots of talk right now about changing this model of maximizing shares to maximizing stakeholder value. Now, bringing this notion of purpose, which I really want to highlight quite a bit in the talk today, to the center of corporate governance is very important in terms of thinking about some of the problems that arise when you have this lack of reinvestment and an obsession with share prices instead of a broader definition of value. But unfortunately, I would argue we haven't seen the change that we need, because unless it's actually underpinned by a different notion of how value itself is created in the first place, than just talking about that kind of redistribution of value to a wider set of stakeholders, doesn't happen. And unless that notion of stakeholder value comes to the center of the ecosystem of how public and private and third sector and civil society work together, then not much change happens. And this is what brings me to this third problem. So it's not just finance and business. Government is really stuck. Its own governance structure is problematic. And I've been writing and kind of obsessing about this now for quite some time, because I think, when at best we talk about government as fixing market failures, at worst, get out of the way. That's why Reagan is there and the kind of Thatcherite view. But at best, to counter that, we say government is important to invest when interest rates are low, to do counter-cyclical spending, which, by the way, is important. So let's not forget it is important. At best, talk about things like carbon taxes needed to correct for negative externalities. At best, talk about the need for investment in areas like public R&D to correct for the lack of investment in that due to the kind of positive spillovers and public good nature of research and development. Then we literally just end up putting these different bandages on the system. We bandage it up, which would be fine if the system was pretty good and just kind of needed a bit of tinkering. If instead we need a transformation in our system, which COVID-19 has revealed to us that we need. If we, need a transformation around sustainable, inclusive green growth and a serious Green Deal to deal with our climate change and global warming problem, then it's not going to be okay to just tinker and bandage things up. And so for this, and sorry for the self-promotional slide, I've been trying to create a different approach and advocate for a very different type of practice, but also new economic theory that I call market shaping and co-creation of the economy, not market fixing. And that really does require then going to the core of how we structure finance, how we think about corporate governance and bring purpose to the center, but also how we think of the role of government as not just patching things up, but being a key leader, a key kind of directional setter for actually steering the economy in a particular way. And, you know, economic growth has not just a rate, but a direction. Innovation, my area, has not just a rate, but a direction. And my work has been trying to bring that directionality to the fore. Let's talk about it. Let's stop pretending that, yeah, the market's there and sometimes it screws up and we just need to come in and fix the problems. What kind of economy do we want? And what does that mean for the actual governance of businesses like the center at the BD School thinks about? What kind of government and public organizations and the decentralized network of different public organizations do we need, and so on. And so in the entrepreneurial state, I looked at this from the kind of need to also reveal that so much of the history needs to be talked about. You know, the fact that everything in our products and smart products that makes them smart and not stupid was actually government finance, like the internet, GPS, Siri, touchscreen display was financed by public entities that were purpose oriented, going after big problems, like DARPA going after the internet because it needed to solve a problem, getting the satellites to communicate. What do we know about that? What do we know about purpose oriented public organizations? How are they set up? What is their internal culture? What does it look like to have that decentralized network of different public organizations across the whole innovation chain, instead of just thinking you can get good universities, basic research upstream and let venture capital solve the problem downstream, right? So in the entrepreneurial state, I interrogated these myths behind, you know, the venture capital, entrepreneurship, garage tinkers, Silicon Valley in one place, and then these kind of boring bureaucrats that are needed at best to fund some basic R&D infrastructure, schools, and then please get out of the way. And that Silicon Valley itself would not have actually happened without a much bolder entrepreneurial state that we just don't talk about. And so we don't even ask ourselves today, what is an entrepreneurial state in the context of climate change? What are the kinds of bold public investments and public-private partnerships and the design of those partnerships that we need? The value of everything, I unpicked that from an economic theory point of view. What does it mean for how we understand value, how value is created, and who the value creators are, and what the values are that we might need to have those explicit discussions about directionality. And in Mission Economy, which is really the book that I'll be focusing on today, kind of turned it into a recipe book, which is like, all right, you know, enough theorizing, let's get our hands dirty. What does this actually look like on the ground? And this was very much on the back of my experience over the last 10 years, trying to convince global civil servants to kind of step outside of that, you know, safe box, but not very useful box of fixing markets into this much bolder area of co-creating and co-shaping the economy. And what are the lessons that we learn on the ground for what it means for designing industrial strategy, designing innovation policy, designing procurement strategy. And I'll tell you guys already, I'm a geek about procurement because procurement is a huge lever that governments have. It's basically government as purchaser. And in the UK, and I'm sure this is true in Canada, our whole innovation budget is 10 billion, but the procurement budget just of the Ministry of Transport, so one ministry, one department, is 40 billion. And, you know, multiply that across Department of Education, Department of Health, Department of Defense. You turn your procurement budget, so government as purchaser, even though I talk a lot about investment, into a dynamic, innovative procurement funnel. So green procurement, including, you know, procuring school meals, make them sustainable, healthy, tasty school meals, as I'll mention later in the talk Sweden is doing today, that all of a sudden becomes part of your innovation budget because it requires transformation, not just kind of handing out money here and there. So what I did in this Mission Economy book about, you know, a moonshot guide to changing capitalism, quite a arrogant title, was to reflect back to what we managed to do 51 years ago when we got, you know, men to the moon and back. You know, unfortunately, yes, it was just men. Today, luckily, women are just as active in the space sector. And even though the social problems that we're facing today are much more complicated than going to the moon, they're wicked problems and inequality that requires huge amounts of also regulatory change, behavioral change, technological change, social change. But still, what are the lessons we can learn from 51 years ago when actually there was a really dynamic and bold and inspirational public-private partnership to do something that, as we all know, is much harder than delivering personal protection equipment to frontline workers, which we did not do in the early stage of this COVID crisis. What have we gotten wrong today that somehow we got right then? And then the earth shots that we have today, which are again harder, they're more wicked than going to the moon. What are the lessons? But also, how can we move, even more boldly and more forwards given that wicked nature? And what was so interesting about Kennedy's speech back in 61 and between 61 and 63, when he was, putting forth this idea, was he was very explicit that, it was going to be hard. He said, we're doing this because it's hard, not because it's easy. And all the words that we use today in the policymaking space, coming back to that market failure fixing narrative, are basically about making things easier, right? This was not their language. Think of the word facilitating. Those of you who have some experience in the policy space will hear that word all the time, that the role of the public sector is to facilitate, to enable, to de-risk. So you're facilitating those that are proud to take on the difficulty. You're de-risking those who are proud to take on the risks. Kennedy didn't talk like that, and they would have never gone to the moon, ever, had they thought this was an easy problem or one to make things easier for someone else, or that someone else would take the risks and we could outsource that risk taking. So that really kind of explicit notion also that it would require lots of experimentation, which, by the way, Roosevelt, if you read his speeches about the New Deal, he kept saying things. We got to experiment. It's not just about investment. There was this great quote where he said, just try something, right? This kind of hunger for new ways of providing solutions for huge problems that we have. And Roosevelt, by the way, invested also in artists in the creative sector and brought them to the table for the Work Progress Administration. So really being bold and trying things that are new. But when Kennedy announced that Apollo program, they had no clue. I mean, they were kind of fudging it of how to get to the moon. They finally landed on this lunar orbit rendezvous way, but they were explicit that it was going to be hard. And in fact, you'll know that the Apollo 1 fire ended in complete tragedy, where 3 astronauts died. And that kind of level of failure, of death, completely tragic failure, what was interesting was they learned from it. That kind of learning by doing, not just being willing to experiment, that's important, but have you been investing in your ability to learn? And the first thing that NASA did on the back of that fire was to change its organizational structure. And I'm curious to hear, also Stephanie's thoughts on this in terms of, if you're a purpose-oriented organization, as NASA, of course, was trying to be, because they wanted to get to the moon and back in a generation. So really, a tight timeline. What did it mean for its own organization? And one of the things that was striking, that because Gus Grissom, before dying, yelled out, how are we going to get to the moon when we can't even talk between 2 or 3 buildings? So that kind of siloed, departmental silo, lack of communication within a big institution like NASA. We know that's also true in many companies. We know that's also true in many governments, right? People complain all the time that, government departments are siloed, each one doing its own thing. The treasuries especially not lined up with, say, the departments of health and departments of environment, and just that need for NASA to pause a bit after that tragic fire and change its organizational structure, run by project managers, each with their teams, but really trying to drive that constant horizontal communication between them, not just for the sake of it, but because they knew if they were going to meet this target, extremely ambitious in a short time period, that was needed. And also the extreme level of interaction. This was not just aerospace. There was investment, innovation in all sorts of different business sectors, like materials, electronics, software. If you haven't seen the film Hidden Figures, amazing, on the role of African-American data scientists, watch it. The whole software industry could almost be seen as an outcome of this moon mission. And so, all these dynamic spillovers that happened along the way, precisely because the project was so intersectoral and collaborative between public and private. But they didn't just say, oh, we're going to partner, oh, we're going to commercialize, oh, we're going to create an innovation ecosystem, as is very trendy to talk about in the innovation world. They designed the partnership with that notion of common purpose at the center. The first thing that NASA did was change the contracts. The contracts went away from being cost plus contracts that were seen as very static, not stimulating much innovation, to being fixed price, almost like a prize scheme, with incentives for innovation and quality improvement. So you'd get more if you did really well, but the fixed price was like, here's a problem we need to solve, and they had about 500 problems they needed to solve to get to the moon. And there was fixed prices for it, but with, again, incentives for constant innovation and quality improvement. So all these different companies, large, medium, and small, that interacted with NASA, that care to design those contracts, but also what I found so interesting and curious in the context of today, the 1%, the 99%, and so on, is they also included this no excess profits clause. And by the way, it doesn't say no profits, because you don't get to the moon through philanthropy, through charity, and you also don't solve COVID-19 and the vaccine problem through charity. You need to go to the heart of the business model. How do we change, again, corporate governance, public-private partnerships, how we produce, how we innovate, how we distribute? And the fact they cared to put a no excess profits clause, I found fascinating, right? Because this was an absolute, collective enterprise, collective investment between all these different actors. Well, of course, then the reward should be shared, and it shouldn't become a gambling casino. Another really interesting thing was that they were aware that if NASA itself became stupid and just outsourced all its capability to some other organizations, it wouldn't even know how to work with the private sector. So, this is something that I've been writing about recently, that I find that this outsourcing, whether it's to consulting companies like McKinsey and PwC, or to other actors like Circa or G4S, this has resulted in a reduction of government capacity, and it's quite stark, actually, the revealing of that again during COVID-19, in terms of also the capacity to use digital and kind of data platforms to understand what's going on, and to, again, deliver a test and trace system without having to outsource it to Deloitte, as the UK government did. And by the way, Deloitte did not do a good job. Anyway, that's a whole other story. So there was this famous quote by Ernest Brackett where he said, if we stop investing, he was the head of procurement, in our own capabilities, we will get captured by brochuremanship. They didn't have PowerPoints at the time. They had brochures. Companies would come in with their brochure to say, work with me. So, who do you even work with? How do you work together? How do you write the terms of reference? That itself is an outcome of capabilities, the dynamic capabilities that we need in both private and public institutions. And yes, it costs a lot of money, but actually not that much, as Kennedy said, compared to cigarettes and cigars that we smoke every year, at least at the time. Now I think people have stopped smoking, at least compared to then. But really, what's interesting here is not so much the amount of money that was spent, but that spillover, that multiplier effect, using Keynes's words, precisely because it catalyzed and crowded in so many different innovative solutions. But as I mentioned, it didn't happen just by miracle. It happened because it was designed into the process itself. And this is where I kind of pause and say, wow, what a story, what a hard feat. They did it together, public and private, working together, huge amount of care to the design of the partnership, definitely government-led, but not micromanaged by government at all. The goals were clear, but they very much kept open the how, because if you micromanage this, you kill innovation. That organizational change, that putting of common purpose at the center, unlike today, where we have lots of actors like Elon Musk in space, and there's hardly a common purpose. The astronauts are actually saying, we can't see anything. It's full of debris. And if you look at also, on the back of huge amounts of infrastructure, where you have Richard Branson, Elon Musk, and others playing now in space, what does it mean to actually have that no excess profits clause? What does it mean to really share in both the risks and the rewards, as NASA back then knew in a confident way that it needed to. It was just as important as what was being done. So what are the lessons for the Earth shots? And what are the Earth shots? Every country, including Canada, have signed up to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. These are broadly defined goals. These are challenges. At the time, it was the space race that was the challenge. But had they just left it at the space race, they would not have gone to the moon. They had to turn it into a mission. They had to turn it into getting to the moon and back in a generation. What does it mean to turn these 17 goals into missions? From no poverty, or climate, clean oceans, and so on. And what does it mean to also reflect on the fact that new voices also have to be at the table? There's this wonderful a poem and song by Jill Scott Heron, Whitey's on the Moon, back in the day of the Apollo program. He's like, you know, we're putting all these billions in space, and yet we have poverty, we have racism, we have all sorts of problems on Earth. And I think the problem is not so much don't spend money in space, you know, spend it on Earth. It really is about how do you structure this so that the benefits, whether it's of the space race, whether it's of, you know, trying to fight climate change, whether it's the big challenges we have today around artificial intelligence, so we actually govern the process so it actually improves people's lives, but also that we have different voices at the table itself on what are the missions, what are the challenges. And we shouldn't forget, by the way, that the SDGs that I just put up there before actually were an outcome of huge amounts of stakeholder kind of interaction globally. And they landed then on these 17 goals. Anyway, so what I've been doing recently, and I'm now working with the BC government, so I'm extremely excited about this partnership, is trying to help governments redesign their industrial strategies and innovation policies precisely to kind of learn from this process of starting with the big challenges, turning them into missions, which have to be interpreted locally. There's, you know, you definitely don't want an economist coming from London to tell, you know, whether it's an Italian government or a Canadian government what to do for their missions, but really getting that stakeholder discussion. And I'll say more about this in a minute because we're working with different communities also in London and neighborhoods in London, bringing, say, resident associations and social housing together to define what a clean growth local strategy looks like. But anyway, setting really bold missions. And the key thing is getting lots of different sectors together to go after them. You know, my point about the moon landing would have never happened had it just been seen as an aerospace problem. Lots of different sectors were at the table. So any clean growth mission, of course, will need lots of different sectors, whether it's real estate, construction, new materials, renewable energy, new forms of insurance, and so on. And then these kind of mission projects, these are those areas, those homework problems that get crowded in, but they don't happen just by talking about it. They happen if you design it into the system. That notion of, you know, fixed price contract for procurement with incentives for innovation, but on a clear goal. What does it mean to, again, crowd in lots of different business and third sector innovation in order to, you know, fuel new types of solutions? So, you know, from Clean Oceans, SDG 14, turning it into a very clear mission of getting 90% of the plastic out, or climate change challenge, turning it into a carbon neutral city strategy. These are examples that I provided to the European Commission, on the back of which now Europe has chosen 5 mission areas, turning these mission areas into different types of missions to be used for the 100 billion Horizon innovation budget that the European Commission has. Again, away from just thinking of things as a sectoral, you know, pot of money, or a type of firm, SMEs, or a type of technology, quantum computing. What does it mean to really get focused on the challenges, turning them into missions, getting lots of different sectors involved, so you don't get a random list of sectors that get handouts, and crowding in those innovative solutions to meet those missions. And, you know, this isn't easy. I wrote a second report for the European Commission, which was all about the how, you know, what does it mean for the crowding in? What does it mean for the impact-driven targets, for the flexibility and adaptability that we need, that Gus Grissom shouted about and before the Apollo 1 fire? What does it mean for bringing, you know, engaging citizens at the table from the beginning? And this is different, of course, from the space mission, which was pretty top-down because of this kind of purely technological feature, but also those public sector capabilities that are needed. You know, how do we evaluate within our treasuries and our finance ministries what's been done outside of a pure cost benefit and net present value calculation? This is just a graph showing you some work we've done recently with the UK Treasury about that. You know, had the moon landing had been judged through a cost benefit analysis, it would have never begun because the danger of complete failure was so high. So what does a market shaping evaluation look like, where you really capture all those dynamic spillovers that happen across the economy? I don't have time to go into this, but we've been working with the BBC, the British public broadcaster, on this because they, as a broadcasting corporation, have thought a lot about these issues, about those new capabilities you need within a public entity. You know, this is a very different type of public entity from NASA, around notions of public value. You know, if you're going to make a soap opera, which sometimes public broadcasters don't make because they think that's just for business and they just do documentaries to fix the market failure problem. If you are going to do a soap opera, what is the notion of public value and public purpose that you're bringing to the table? Or a talk show, EastEnders, a soap opera about the working class versus Dallas and Dynasty about the 1%. Let me just move on. With industrial strategy, this means not focusing, as I mentioned, on sectors, but on challenges. This is some work we did with the UK government, helping them to move away from this random list of sectors they had, which was aerospace, aeronautics, life sciences, creative industries, and financial services, to do what, right? So transforming this industrial strategy into a challenge-oriented strategy, and then turning these different challenges like clean growth or future of mobility into concrete missions, which included for the UK government having a public transport system that was 100% accessible by people with disabilities. Well, that's going to crowd in lots of really interesting bottom-up homework problems that would be different if you just looked at transport as a sector. And not as a challenge for, again, very different sectors to work together around innovative solutions. In Scotland, we helped set up, this is through the new institute I set up in London, the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at UCL. We helped Scotland set up a whole new public bank, but instead of just being a public bank that hands out money, to those businesses that might have a louder voice, what does it mean to have a mission-oriented public bank that's providing that patient long-term committed finance to those organizations that are willing, so picking the willing, not picking the winners, to move with you towards important targets that you have. And in their case, they were very interested in helping kind of the digital technology space and startups work with the NHS on really important public health goals. Let me just move on. In Sweden, something super interesting that I've learned is, they started with a really bold strategy about a fossil-free welfare state and then landed it on really concrete places like school meals that I mentioned in the beginning. So public education and school meals, really important. Definitely during the lockdown, we realized how important they were. Well, what does it mean to procure school meals with really bold targets like healthy, tasty, not just IKEA meatballs, and sustainable procurement strategies in order to deliver those really high quality meals, but also getting kids involved. So this participatory element being so important, learning about the school meals through the curriculum, helping to design the school meals. And that's probably the hardest bit, but probably the most important. If you think about the incredible polarization we have today, whether it's, with the Trump situation in the US or Brexit in the UK, and every country has its own polarization. What does it mean to really, truly, not in a condescending, tokenistic way, bring a wider group of people to the table? And surely in BC, this means giving a serious voice to the Indigenous community ex ante, not just ex post, being part of that planning, designing of the missions themselves. In Barcelona, what's been interesting is they've done this also with data platforms, bringing hackers into the city government to create a much less intermediated relationship between the city and data. So every time we click on our city mapper, we're creating data. The city has hired city hackers to then make sure that that understanding of data and governance of data platforms improves public transport, public housing, public health. In Camden, where I live, I should show you pictures outside, but I won't. A big issue is that we have extreme inequality sitting back to back with, incredible wealth. This is a microcosm of the world, but also the knowledge corridor where my own university sits, the British Museum, the British Library. We have trains that get you to Paris in 2 hours, the Wellcome Trust, and so on, sitting side by side with extreme deprivation in Somerstown, a neighborhood literally sitting on the front of the British Library, where there's poverty, there's knife crime, and so on. What does it mean to nest these missions in youth centers, in community centers, in social housing, as I mentioned before, and bring people living in the social housing to the table, voices not only being heard, but actually part of that designing and planning process? And I must say that the Camden missions currently are the thing that excites me the most. Since I'm out of time, maybe I'll just end with this one here, just saying that, we couldn't be more thrilled in the institute that I'm running to be working actually with British Columbia on your own challenges. And we've just begun, but it's very important for any country, region, or city. We also work very closely with mayors that when you bring that directionality to the fore, when you stop saying we're going to grow for growth's sake and take seriously this concept of building back better, radically better, forward better, what does that mean for the new types of capabilities that are required on the ground? What does it mean for the types of conditionalities that we might need? This is the French Minister of Finance who put strong conditionalities with the French recovery program, so that the recovery funds given to Renault and Air France were conditional on them committing to lowering their carbon emissions in the next 5 years. So not just a bailout scheme, but a conditional loan, putting that real partnership and purpose at the center of such a difficult moment. Elizabeth Warren, by the way, argued that we should have that with share buyback schemes, no share buybacks for those companies getting huge recovery funds, and so on. And during a period where health innovation is so important, what does it mean to make sure we're governing our intellectual property rights with this notion of common purpose? Patents have been abused for many years. They're too upstream, they're too wide, they're too strong. They're often used for rents as opposed to really creating kind of collective intelligence. And in an era where we have what Dr. Tedros, the head of the World Health Organization, calls vaccine apartheid, where 80% of doses are being hoarded by 10% of countries, what does it mean to really, again, reflect on how we can't just rely on charity, but we need to be producing and innovating in a fundamentally different way, and producing that decentralized capacity for distribution in a way that really has that notion of common purpose and missions at the core. Let me just stop here and say that all this is about actually walking the talk of stakeholder value, given that it's the center of corporate governance and sustainability that is helping to host this session today, to really walk that talk, bringing that notion of purpose to the center of public-private partnerships, rethinking value, markets as co-created, organizations, all, including government ones, with dynamic capabilities, finance, outcomes-based budgeting, instead of just worrying about where's the money going to come from. No one asked that with the moon landing. No one asked that when we go to war. What does it mean to get pre-distributive relationships, so we don't have to just pick up the mess with redistribution? So get those conditions right from the start. What does it mean to partner in a different way, so we have symbiotic and mutualistic ecosystems, not parasitic ones? And what does it mean to truly have that participatory, open co-design that I've been talking about in terms of bringing those new voices to the table? And again, I think this is important for any region of the world that's interested in change, transformation, innovation, and changing our trajectory of growth to really deliver on the SDGs, and especially to have more inclusive and sustainable growth, but to experiment on the ground with the how. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And before I dive into my own questions, I just want to remind everyone that they can submit their questions using the Q&A. We've had some great ones coming in, so we're going to try and address as many of them as we can and bundle them together a bit. And so, Mariana, I did want to pick up on this idea of the mechanisms. So you've illustrated, whether it's through vaccines or others, that investments in basic science in our current economy do all too often end up getting kind of concentrated as private gain and compounding inequity in access and inequity overall in the process. And so I do want to ask the question, how do we ensure that the benefits of public investment are shared by all, but especially in the context when in a region like British Columbia, where we have a lot of small, medium-sized enterprises, where we have a lot of local businesses, where we have a very strong and developing cooperative movement. So how do we translate this into that environment? And what are some of the kind of contractual and institutional mechanisms that help us to do that? I know that there's been in the chat a lot of interest. You've talked about procurement in particular as a lever. One of the experiences I've seen is that as you try and formalize procurement and you put ESG kind of requirements into procurement, then in some ways, what that can actually do is create a lot of pressure against using local suppliers, indigenous suppliers, co-ops, all the kinds of organizations that in theory we are really wanting to support. So what have you seen that's working, and how, what are the mechanisms do you think that can be effective?
Really great question. And it's a good warning too, because something that sounds good can actually become part of the problem. And that's often the case. So first, how I would frame also the kind of bigger question you're asking is, what are the different ways that we can make sure we're not just kind of plowing money in the system and hoping for the best, but actually truly, again, design into it a way to share in the rewards, both, again, ex ante in terms of how to design the goals themselves, but especially in terms of your question, how to make sure we're not just socializing risks and privatizing rewards. And I wrote quite a bit about that in the entrepreneurial state and consider different ways to do that. Part of it is the kind of first recognition of having a dialogue and a narrative and a story. I often remind people that Plato said storytellers rule the world, about the fact that value truly is created collectively. If you don't start with that, and at best it becomes this idea that yes, business is creating all this value, but it needs to be shared collectively, then it's hard to get over the kind of much deeper bottlenecks that we have. And so to do that, it really needs to be reflected on, like, how is value created collectively? What are the huge amounts of social benefits that have been reaped by companies, and actually admitting that, so it's not just their own genius. And if you think of, again, Elon Musk, he's the perfect example because he's treated like this genius. That's literally the adjective that's often used, but he got $5 billion from the US government for his 3 companies, but also SpaceX would be nothing without NASA. But Tesla itself received the same amount of money that Solyndra got. Solyndra is a solar company that went bust. Everyone in America knows about it because it went bust. It got the money through a guaranteed loan program of the Obama administration. It failed, and it created this huge kind of setback for government because the usual kind of picking winners problem, oh, government's a basket case, just kind of fix the rules and get out of the way. There was no open discussion that the same amount of money went to Tesla that was successful. Not only that, there was no questioning, which was your question, which is how do you share in the rewards of that portfolio mechanism where inevitably, to speak to any venture capitalist, for every success, you have to assume at least kind of 8 or 9 failures. And what was striking there was that the Department of Energy said to Elon Musk, if you don't pay back the loan, we get 3 million shares in your company, which is exactly the opposite of what you should do. If you do pay back the loan and you're successful, we get 3 million shares in your company. Had they done that, the price per share went from 9 to 90. That difference multiplied by 3 million would have more than paid back the Solyndra loss, 500 million, and the next round of investment. So that kind of public venture capitalist role, a public wealth fund kind of role is, I think, really important to get those pre-distributive mechanisms right. And just bringing it really to the center of communities also, so not just kind of big space race and Tesla kind of investments. There's one of my PhD students is called George Mapanga. He's otherwise known as George the Poet. He's won a Peabody Award for the best podcast. And he's doing a PhD on something that's fascinating. He says, young Black musicians are at the heart of the hip hop, rap industry, which has created, trillions of dollars worth of wealth. None of that money gets reinvested back into the communities that have created that wealth. Many of these young kids end up in the criminal justice system. They aren't trained to even see themselves as value creators, and we don't also produce a kind of rap industry that allows lots of different people to be making money from it instead of kind of 1 in a million. So looking at the contracts, looking at the reinvestment cycles of this wealth that's collectively created, but often just gets siphoned out, looking at the narrative of who is creating wealth in the economy, all these are part of that problem. And just because I'm speaking too long, and I'll just quickly come to the end to this, other, mechanisms besides equity stakes, like in the Tesla example, are important. That issue of governing intellectual property rights, that means making sure that they're used to diffuse as much collective intelligence as possible. So to as many different types of firms, so small and medium enterprises can benefit, instead of we're allowing patents to be so upstream as they are today. So the tools for research are privatized. And if the patents are too wide and too strong, hard to license, we're actually stifling innovation. And that's not what patents were meant for. And so that kind of active, proactive governance of the system, not just in terms of putting money into the system, but governing it so that we really fuel as much collective value creation, and in this case, collective intelligence, has to be designed into the contracts.
So I guess when I'm hearing the Tesla example, one of the things that comes to mind is there's this sense here that if you structure things properly, that government can kind of share in the proceeds of innovation. But I do wonder whether government sharing in the proceeds of innovation is enough to overcome the inequality that we're seeing.
Yeah. And in fact, sorry, I stopped because I felt I was talking too much, but you've now allowed me to keep talking on the second part of the answer to your first question, which is who is then going to make the decisions, right? So if, let's assume we get it right, at least the basic thing right, which is why are we just, again, socializing risks and privatizing the rewards? Assume this money comes back into some sort of common pool, a common wealth fund, a public bank. Then how can we make sure that the public, the community, and definitely this is, I think, a huge issue in BC in terms of your Indigenous communities, having a voice in where that money then goes, where it gets reinvested, how it's governed. So having community-driven, or again, stakeholder-driven governance mechanisms for these pots, like a public fund, whether it's a sovereign wealth fund, a community fund, a city fund, but also, anyway, let's just call it public funds. How the decisions are made about where the investments go. I think that's a real opportunity to actually bring kind of civil society at the center of not just benefiting from the investments, that someone else decides, but of actually having that that space for discussion. There's an artist that I've sort of worked with, Oliver Elias, and he says that public space should be a space where you feel safe to disagree. So definitely on the back, again, of all this polarization that we've seen globally, how do we create spaces where we together can actually debate and contest even what we mean by sustainable growth? And so if you have a sustainable growth fund, you don't want it just to be, again, a bunch of professors, businesses, and politicians deciding that for everyone it's good to retrofit their homes. That bigger question of how do we live together in a more sustainable way, and what does that even mean? Those discussions and those voices that have to be much wider and participatory should ideally be able also to govern the decisions made in something like a community wealth fund or a state fund or a city wealth fund.
I think that's true, and I think there's important dynamics in the BC context, and certainly in many contexts that have a deep colonial imprint on them, where when we talk about that safe space to engage, can be really challenging because the institutional structures that we have in place don't allow for that safety. And I think even the language, right, around stakeholders, it's very clear that Indigenous communities are not just stakeholders, but in fact rights holders. And so that becomes a really important dynamic in how we think about how this plays out in our context as well. I wanted to elevate this back up to kind of a global level as well, because I think that these structures that we talk about, the kind of Western economy, the capitalist system that we reside in, is one that creates constraints on how we can innovate going forwards. So you've written recently about the consensus emerging from the G7 summit in Cornwall last June, that it has the potential to move us beyond reactively fixing market failures and instead to proactively thinking in terms of the interest of the common good. Do you have confidence that governments may actually be moving towards pursuing resilient, sustainable, regenerative, equitable economies? And what do you think it actually will take for something like the Cornwall Consensus to take hold?
Sorry, I don't know how I went on mute. Great question. And what the Cornwall Consensus was, for those who don't know what we're talking about, is that there was the G7 moment in June. Canada is one of the G7 countries where the leaders met, and there was a resilience panel that I took part in. I was actually representing Italy. I've got 3 different citizenships. I sometimes have to remember which country am I here for. And we came up with this Cornwall Consensus, kind of as a catchy phrase to say we can't just have better policy in these different areas, climate, health, and so on, without actually having a different consensus. So the idea was, given that it was taking place in Cornwall, to have a Cornwall Consensus that would depart from the so-called Washington Consensus, which had, is really the kind of formulation of neoliberal economics, where again, the state is there just to kind of facilitate, but not really to direct, because the idea that the market and business knows best. That has actually fueled all sorts of policies like the IMF and World Bank policies that have in the developing world had these very, problematic conditionalities attached to actually reducing public budgets, which then, of course, fall onto things like public healthcare, public education. And we know that that's a problem. The IMF has even written about that as a problem, admitting that it's an issue that has hurt growth, not helped growth. And by the way, we're not learning from that now on the back of COVID-19 with these recovery funds. There's many countries that are saying, okay, we did the furlough schemes, we did the kind of public recovery. Now we're going to have to start tightening our belts again. So that's a huge warning not to do that. But coming to your point about the faith, no, unfortunately, if you just look at the numbers, how, the lack of solidarity right now with the vaccine, where again, Dr. Tedros calls it a huge moral failure and uses strong words like vaccine apartheid. The fact that companies like Pfizer have not signed up to the TRIPS waiver in terms of the governance of intellectual property rights, the fact that we, talk about things like global warming, but then you have the COVID-19 recovery fund still going to very problematic fossil fuel projects. It's just obvious. It's not working. And this is why actually with the G20, which is happening next week, or it's sort of been happening over the last month, is being hosted by Italy. This council that I'm running for World Health Organization, it's only women, by the way, from all over the world, from the 5 continents. We have 11 women economists, and we've come together to kind of put out stark messages. And for G20, we're saying, stop just pretending this is a finance problem. Yes, we need more money. Of course, we need more money in order to deliver vaccines. But a lot of the problem is the capacity on the ground hasn't been there. And the ability to distribute and to manufacture on the ground has not been there. So unless we have proper global industrial strategies and make sure they have global capacity and all over the world, and I'm thinking especially right now in Africa, where there's so many people that have not had even their first jabs, then you can't just increase liquidity and money into the system and hope for the best. So a lot of that is about designing these public-private partnerships with very different types of conditionalities, less about cutting public budgets, much more about actually increasing that capacity. And if we don't do that, we're simply not gonna solve the deep sources of the problems that I talked about in the beginning. We also talk about the fact that we need to be really bold. Why don't we have a CERN, a big public lab globally around climate change or social problems? And it's not just about hard sciences. It's not just about get the physicists and the biologists to solve the problem. We need, sociologists and the humanities and anthropologists to help, people to really understand also a lot of where the bottlenecks are also that a lot of people just don't feel like that they're part of that, game of globalization, technological change, sustainable growth. And so the need also for much more empathy in the system, which means listening. And if you think of all the social movements out there, Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, Fridays for the Future, we shouldn't forget that it was movements in the past that got us things like the weekend, the 8-hour workday, the fact that children don't work in factories. That's through the labor movement. People died to get us the weekend. So what's the equivalent of that today in order to really, truly put this notion of purpose and the common good at the center? And I love that you said rights holders, not stakeholders. I'm going to start saying that. I'm never going to say the word stakeholder again. Anyway, what does it mean to really talk about health as a human right at the center of how we produce, how we distribute, how we consume? That requires a very different type of consensus. And the answer, unfortunately, is no, we're not seeing that. But that's why we need a very demanding and loud voice and different voices at moments like the G20, because otherwise, as my kids say, they're just waffling.
Thank you. So I would love to invite my colleague, Dara Kelly, Assistant Professor of Indigenous Business Leadership. She also has a question for you.
So 8SWL, thank you so much, Mariana. It's been just absolutely fascinating listening to you. I Quiquihas til squeak, Tlitl Kuala Camel, so I carry the name Quiquihas. I have a question. So I'm interested in processes of determining value when there are competing foundations around how to determine value. So whose knowledge is given value? So for example, you've mentioned and we've talked about the history here in Canada, and our legacy of colonization is deep. But more and more indigenous philosophies that preceded European settlement are emerging to shape the economic landscape. So how can we bridge competing definitions of value?
Well, you just said it in the most eloquent way, which I wouldn't be able to match. So I think what you're asking and saying is central, because if we don't do that, we are just, adding layers onto a very problematic way that we have even understood even what is the economy and how is value created in the economy. That's why I actually, again, began my book, The Value of Everything, with that quote by Plato, that storytellers rule the world. Particular stories that we're telling about where value comes from are the problem and kind of at the center of the inequality. You can't just have progressive taxation to solve inequality if then the underlying understanding of who's creating wealth, who's a value creator, who's a wealth creator doesn't change. And in fact, if you look at Piketty's book on inequality and look at the decades where inequality kind of rose the most, they were always accompanied by stories and narratives about who needed that massive tax break. The Venture Capital Association, by the way, negotiated one of the biggest tax breaks ever back in the late 70s. So capital gains fell 50% in 4 years. And I know that sounds kind of mechanistic, like you asked a really ambitious question, and now I'm talking about tax, but that's the connection. These regressive policies, and there's all sorts of regressive policies that increase inequality, don't just happen because someone says something and someone listens. They are embedded in narratives and stories about where we think value is coming from. And so that need to bring new stories, new voices to the table is absolutely essential in order to get better instruments, better practices, better taxation, better innovation tools. And unfortunately, we always jump to the end, say, oh, I have a nifty little new policy that someone can implement. Well, even if it is a good policy, it's not going to stick because that old story is still there. So I love how you framed your question. And by the way, that's exactly the question that my PhD student, George the Poet, is looking at in terms of the way that in some ways you could look at the whole Black Lives Matter, how do we even understand value as created by Black communities? And, that is just incredibly at the kind of phase one of the problem. And unless we look at that and just look at the symptoms of racism, then we don't solve it. So thank you for asking it. And it sounds like you know more of the answer than I do. So sorry if I was waffling.
Thank you. So I'd also like to invite Dea Steiner. She's one of our BBA students, and she also has a question for you.
Hi, Mariana. Thanks for being here. This has been really interesting so far. So of course, decarbonization will require efforts and investments from all countries. I'm curious to know that if the Global North were to implement climate-related mission-oriented strategies by building on their existing systems, how could they support Global South countries, which may already be at capacity, to do the same?
Really good question. And on the back of COVID-19, actually, with UNDP, the Development Program of the United Nations, we wrote a report with the Institute looking globally at which countries had, kind of done better than others. And there was countries like Kerala, or the region in India called Kerala, and Vietnam, that did so much better. And you see this also with climate change. Some countries in some parts of the world, even within a development category, are just doing better in terms of actually getting their acts together. And this doesn't happen just kind of miraculously. It again happens on the back of investments that are being made. In the case of both Vietnam and Kerala, on the back of also crises that they had experienced, like the Nipah crisis. Instead of then outsourcing the problem to someone else, they invested a lot within innovating within their own public administrations and creating a more trusted relationship between business, academia, government, civil society, and so on. So first, it's just to bring it back always to that it's not about what can the developed world do for the developing world. It's also what do we know that is so important in developed and developing countries for their ability to govern really, really difficult challenges, whether it's climate, health, Brexit in the UK, and so on. And coming back to global warming and the need for a global response, it's not going to be solved by any one country or any one part of the world. Most of the pollution and most of the problem has been created by developed countries. And so the need to actually move much quicker in the Western world and to then allow, instead of using these, kind of WTO and state aid rules that have actually often impeded the developed part of the world, the developing parts of the world, to also make those really needed investments with the visible hand of the state and not to see it as kind of anti-competitive. The question is, how can you have both a kind of entrepreneurial state, but an entrepreneurial state that is really pushing for a different type of growth? You know, in South Africa, for example, where you have huge challenges within the government in terms of, you know, history also of recently of corruption and so on. What does it mean for its large, huge state-owned enterprise, Eskom, in the energy sector, to start to become part of the solution and not part of the problem? What does that mean, not just in terms of public-private conditionalities that I've talked about, but public-public conditionalities? The money that a large state-owned enterprise, in many places in the global south have state-owned enterprises that are just kind of stuck in the status quo. Italy, by the way, where I'm from, has lots of state-owned enterprises that are stuck and they're part of the problem. How can you use mission-oriented policies to catalyze that kind of change, to demand that transformation happen on the back of, you know, money being provided by the treasuries? In Germany, which is not in the global south, they've done something that I've mentioned would be really useful in South Africa. So the steel sector, when it asked for a loan from the government created a very stringent condition that steel had to lower their material content in order to receive the public loan, which they did. And now they have the greenest steel sector in the world because they used repurpose, reuse, recycle technologies. That kind of, you know, transformation of steel, cement, construction, and natural resource sectors in the global south really require pretty quick transformation, but that can only happen also with real kind of government support. And if that is then seen as anti-competitive by these kind of global trade rules, that becomes part of the problem in terms of the deep transformations that are required. And that's why I wrote The Entrepreneurial State, to remind people that we wouldn't have had Silicon Valley without a strong state. So why aren't we allowing that also in the global south? But it's not just about state investments, it's about steering those investments towards transitions that are sustainable and inclusive.
Thanks so much. So there's a number of themes coming through in some of the questions that we've been receiving, and maybe I'll kind of hit some of those high level themes so that we can see that we can address as many of them as we can. So there's a number of questions that really are interested in the role of the community, the role of civil society, and the role of the not-for-profit sector in contributing to this transformation. There's also a lot of questions about how individuals can take this work forward and make change. And of course, there's also a lot of questions about growth. Do we need growth? The value of the GDP, and this tension around sustainable growth. So maybe we could start with the role of civil society and the not-for-profit sector, and your thoughts on how the broader community can be involved in this shift.
Sure. It's interesting because I think, unfortunately, we use the word civil society to mean like everything that's not government or business, and that itself, I think, needs to change. Like, you know, even trade unions are put often into the word civil society, and I think that's a problem. So I think we should be much more specific. So, for example, I found, or I think, and you know, I don't have completely developed thoughts on this, but the way that we're overly relying on philanthropies and charity in some sectors is part of the problem. So I wouldn't advocate for more use of philanthropies and charities. I think we've got enough of them, and unfortunately, they are often filling the gap. And it's the gap that's the problem. Why are we creating these gaps that then we end up needing these crutches for, which then don't necessarily create the conditions and the stimulus and the conditions for change, which then makes the philanthropies themselves irrelevant. And it's not the fault of the philanthropies. But anyway, the point is that there's charitable kind of organizations that are very important within the civil society space, and they should be treated differently from, say, the non-for-profit sector, which is still trying to create, you know, a business model, not based on charity. And the question is, what does that mean? Like, how do we bring that notion of purpose again, which is a big word out there right now, precisely in the, I now have to say it, stakeholder governance kind of literature and momentum. This notion of purpose, what does it mean to have purposeful companies? I think that's like the much bigger question of how to bring that notion of purpose at the center of how civil society interacts with business, interacts with government, and so on, and a purposeful relationship at the center of the ecosystem as I was mentioning with the moon landing, has to actually be designed into the process. And so even though you might have some good companies wanting to do good, if the relationships themselves within the ecosystem haven't been redesigned through that notion of conditionalities and so on, I think we're kind of missing the trick. I come back though to the notion of movements. I mean, where I think we need a lot more thinking is, social movements. I mentioned the labor movement, the feminist movement, the civil rights movement, and right now there's so many different movements calling for change. I think a really important issue is how do we allow those movements a seat at the table, so that they're not just always kind of in reactive mode. But the green movement in Germany actually was hugely relevant for then the government setting the Energiewende policy. I've realized that my screen is going dead because there's no light in here, so let me just turn on the lights.
That's okay. Marianne, as you're doing that, I'll just say that we have 70, 80 questions. There's so much enthusiasm for you. So obviously we're not going to get to them all, but I'm wondering if I could pick up this theme and maybe just kind of your quick thoughts on these. The question on growth. So
I'm not a believer in no growth. Yes, I am not a believer. I once said this. I was on a panel with Tim Jackson, who's Mr. No Growth. I said, no growth is for the bobo, les bobos, la bourgeoisie bohème. And I wasn't very popular at that conference. So, and I'm sort of being facetious there. So I think the points made by those who talk about no growth are very important points. And there's, real validity and the underlying kind of, discussion and issues. However, I fundamentally believe that the problem is redirecting growth. Without growth, we're not going to solve huge types of problems that we have currently in the world, again, around hunger, poverty, productivity, and so on. However, when I say a redirection of growth, I mean literally a redirection. So completely changing our production systems. I mean, if you look at even how, and this is a small example, but Denmark today is growing through creating digital high-tech services for the green sectors to transform themselves. So to help steel lower its material content, that also requires digital services. That has created a huge startup community and new types of services and growth. Anytime, if we want to stop having an economy where we just buy things and then throw them out, we're going to need all sorts of new skills, like maintaining things like we used to have. If you go to Cuba, if anyone's gone to Cuba, you'll see they still have cars from the 1950s. So there's a maintenance, like repair, reuse, recycle, that shouldn't just be this peripheral thing that people kind of DIY. It should be, a huge amount of innovation, social, organizational, and technological, to reduce the material content through recycle, reuse, and repurpose at the center of how we produce. That will be new skills, new jobs, new sectors, but reducing the material content of production. So there's many examples I could give like that. And that means re-steering growth toward, and by the way, that also requires a whole new taxation system. We currently tax materials less than we tax labor. I mean, that's crazy. That is hardly gonna, reduce the material content of our production system.
Okay. We have a number of questions about innovation and cultures of innovation and how you spark innovation. Canada stands out among other countries for having this strong academic research and producing a lot of ideas, but there's weak business sector R&D. And so how do you, and a number of comments and questions have also pointed to a lack of innovation within our public sector as well. Yep. So how do we challenge this tackle this challenge of low business sector innovation and low public sector innovation?
I'm so glad you asked that, because I normally, in another presentation I usually focus a lot on that. And a good friend of mine who used to run the Brazilian public bank called BNDES used to say, Brazil is capitalism without capitalists. In other words, not enough business investment. And many countries have that. Canada, definitely. And your own BERD, business R&D spending over GDP is lower than OECD average. And, one interesting thing about Canada is that a lot of the policies up until now, and I know obviously there's different regions and different governments within Canada, but in general, if you look at the national statistics, which we have, if you look at the OECD figures, Canada has overly relied on tax incentives. And so this idea that, for example, in order to get investment and innovation going, you just need an R&D tax incentive or some other type of incentive for business, often all that does is increase profits. It doesn't increase investment. And there's no profits problem. There's profits are globally at a record level in terms of the profit share of GDP. The labor share is at a record low, and not because capital has become, so smart. So it's that profits, again, as I mentioned in the beginning, aren't being reinvested back in. But if you just have a tax incentive, you've just made it cheaper to do something. You haven't necessarily created what economists would call additionality, getting investment to happen that wouldn't have happened otherwise. So part of it is that silly policies get you that, and allow kind of inertial and static conditions to remain. But also, what actually drives business investment is the perception of where future opportunities lie. And so it's not just about the conditionalities I mentioned before, which I do think are really important. Every dollar of Canadian grants, loans, procurement, bailouts, recovery should be conditional on investment. Don't give out any money, forget the subsidies and the guarantees. That should be conditional on something coming back. Investment, innovation in a green, inclusive direction. But also the policies have to be inspirational. And that's where the missions come in. And the missions are also about the conditionalities. But that first point about, hey, there's a whole cool new area out there, like the example with Denmark of, green digital high-tech services, that can inspire, like, oh, wow, yeah, I'm going there. But if you're just creating a tax incentive, you're not going to make it inspiring to move in a particular area, whether it be nanotech, green tech, space tech. And so that's the role of these kind of early stage, high risk, capital intensive, bolder kind of government investments in new areas, again, around these challenges that set the way, that create an expectation, especially if it's aligned and, with certain instead of stop and go policies, expectations of where future growth and technological opportunities lie. If you don't have that, you're just making it maybe easier for something to happen, and profits go up, but you don't get that investment. So I think it requires both bold conditionalities, but also bold policies that make it, certain areas seem pretty exciting, and then that will crowd in business investment.
Thank you. And with the last minute that we have, there are so many people here that are interested in thinking about what this means in terms of their individual role and how they contribute to this collective change. So what's your advice to us in terms of how we take this forward as individual actions to try and contribute to this collective shift that we need to see?
Well, going back to Cheryl's points in the beginning and also your question about the Indigenous communities, I feel like BC has a very rare, just the fact that you're interrogating this notion of stakeholder value and calling it, rights holders. And what does that mean then to talk about rights instead of this kind of lazy notion of stakeholder governance, and putting that notion of rights and the common good at the center of the design, even of something like a new wealth fund, for BC and who's governing it. I think it would be really interesting to start there. And also, I'm really keen on groups starting with very local stuff and then scaling up the lessons and turning it kind of regional, national, or international. And that procurement example, by the way, for many countries that don't have innovative procurement, just start on something like the school meals, and then scale up those lessons. And so, it could be starting with the design of a new institution when it doesn't exist, like a new innovation fund, or redesigning existing tools like procurement. But I think given on the back of your own challenges, both around global warming and the recent fires you've had, and the kind of urgent need to bring Indigenous voices at the heart of the economy instead of the periphery, I think the combination of those two challenges right there and putting them at the center of how you bring that directionality and mission setting and mission governance at the fore, I think it's a very fertile ground for social innovation, and the world will learn from you because actually those bits are the hardest.
Thank you. This has been an amazing conversation. I know many of us wish that it could have gone on for a lot longer.
Well,
to
I'm
ask
an
more.
alumni. I'm an alumni of SFU. I'm going to be coming there.
All right. Well, we can't wait to have you back, and please, we'll be very excited to have more conversations with you in the future when you're able to join us. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us this morning for this set of engaging conversations. Of course, our thanks go out to John Monroe and the John M. Monroe Lecture Endowment, to BMO, to SFU Public Square, and to the SFU BD Center for Corporate Governance and Sustainability for the resources and support to hold this event. We thank all of you on the line for joining us today, for your amazing comments and contributions and questions. Our final thanks go out to Mariana Mazzucato for an inspiring and hopeful conversation. For everyone, a link to the recording will be sent out after the event. And I really thank everyone for joining us today, and especially you, Mariana.
And I thank you. And by the way, by alumni, I mean that you've given me this wonderful honorary doctorate. So thank you so much again. And I hope to visit for the first time SFU soon. And thank you for these wonderful questions, amazing questions. I've written them down, so I'm going to keep thinking about them. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.